Okay, if we could just get the door in the back, please. Jim? Good afternoon. I've been told we are going to simulcast this, so we need just a moment before we start. If we could have just one break here for them to get the equipment ready, and then we'll start. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Kahn. I have the honor of chairing the Board of Visitors here at Duke Law School, and I'm so pleased to welcome you this afternoon to a conversation with Dean Katharine Bartlett. Let me tell you a little bit about the genesis of this event. We hope that in the spring 2007 issue of Duke Law Magazine to feature a thoughtful and comprehensive interview with the Dean about leadership, leading this law school for almost 7 years, and her own scholarship and influences on the law school, and influences on her personally. We often hear from Kate, but we rarely hear about her. In her own words, something, I guess, about that New England modesty, that Connecticut family farm that we've heard about. As we were thinking about how to go about this, Teresa Newman came up with the brilliant idea that this should be a public conversation. And so that is what it will be today. We pressed the case for such a conversation with Kate, and we're delighted that she agreed, and that Erwin Chemerinsky also agreed to take part as host and interviewer. Now, as many of you know, Erwin is the Alston and Bird Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science here at Duke. He is well known as a scholar of the Constitution and federal courts, as a prolific author and commentator, and as an appellate and Supreme Court advocate. Professor Chemerinsky joined the Duke Law faculty in 2004, coming to us from the University of Southern California, and in just over 2 years has become positively beloved as a teacher and mentor to Duke Law students and undergraduates. He was selected by a faculty committee as Duke's 2006 University Scholar and Teacher of the Year, and he was awarded that last month at the university's Founder Day celebration. I will leave it to Erwin to bring out the bio of Kate. So please welcome then Professor Erwin Chemerinsky and Professor and Dean Kate Bartlett.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Kate, I know I speak for everyone in this room in thanking you for doing this. I think the best place to start is with your parents. What's their background? I know your dad died some time ago, your mom's still alive. What was your dad like? What's your mom like?
What a place to start. Well, my parents are, I might need to set this in the whole setting of the whole family, because I grew up with parents and siblings and also grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins all on the same premises. So it was really kind of an old-fashioned extended family experience. My grandparents lived in a house on the middle of this 200-acre farm, and my parents and our siblings, mostly we all slept in a separate house, although there was a lot of sleeping at Granny and Gramps' house, but mostly we were a nuclear family. In one house on one side, my aunt and uncle and cousins, another house, and as people got married and the various members of the family continued to build out from the center core. And growing up, we all kind of grew up together and shared chores and whatnot. We can talk more about that later. My parents were, of course, very, very special people to me. They were very, very smart, practical people. Neither of them were college graduates. In fact, graduating from college was not a characteristic of any, and it really didn't come along until my generation. But it was a very practical family where common sense was highly valued. I was often ridiculed because I didn't have quite as much common sense as what was expected on the farm, but I tried to make up for it in other ways. But my parents were, my father, the family farm had enough chickens for our own eggs and enough cows for our own milk, and we had always a couple of cattle, and occasionally some goats and pigs and other things, but it was all just for the family consumption. We had a lumber mill out in the back of our house, and that was what people did for cash. And my father, his role in the family business was to drive a truck and to go get the logs and to bring the logs back to the mill. So he drove a lot of miles. He was gone usually by 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and often not home when at least when I was younger, when we went to bed at 7 or 7:30. So worked really, really long hours and hard. My mother was kind of a farm housewife for a while, although when my youngest sister was born, she did go she began work first as a secretary and then as a registrar of voters and as a administrator in the town hall in Guilford. This is a very small town, and she ended up being registrar of voters for 30 years in our town. Just recently retired. My father did die early at age 59, about 30 years ago, over 30 years ago. But my mother's still alive, living in the same house, and all of my siblings are still in the same area. My brother now lives where my grandparents lived in the center, and my sister lives on the other side, and another sister lives about 20 miles away in New Haven.
What was your childhood like growing up on the farm?
As I said, it was kind of an integrated whole in terms of the family structure. We had a lot of chores. When I think of my childhood, I think of a lot of freedom. People didn't tail us too much, or they didn't really, no one really knew where we were often, but at the end of the day, if our chores weren't done, there was a lot of trouble. But we had, we all had our chores, and I can tell you what some of the things were. But we generally speaking, in the summer, we had to weed four rows of corn before we were allowed to do anything else. Cleaned out the stables before I went to school, the horse stables, and also in the evening, and fed the animals. That part of it's not as romantic as it sounds, because it was very,
Cleaning out stables doesn't sound romantic at all.
Well, some people say, that sounds like such a cool, so what a great way to grow up. And when I was growing up, although in North Guilford, where we lived and where the people I went to as far as elementary school, a lot of us lived on farms. But once I went downtown to school, this was Guilford, a town of, at that time, about 12,000 people. We were running up then against people who went to the movies on Friday night and, were already dating when we entered the downtown schools in the 7th grade. And they didn't clean out stables before they came to school. And so the integration there of the North Guilford kids in Guilford, was kind of a culture shock all the way around. But I did, even at that time, I value the sense of contribution to a common good. There was a certain kind of imperative on a farm where that people aren't making up chores, that these are things that actually have to get done, and that you're an important cog in this wheel, and that you really have a part to play, and there wasn't much parental attention or grandparental attention on what are these on. I think this is generational, not just as a result of differences relating to the farm, but I don't get the sense that there was any parental obsession, as maybe many of us have experienced with our own children, of making sure that our children have everything they need and have the experiences they want and are well programmed and grow up with athletic skills and social skills and all that kind of stuff. There's not a lot of concern about that, but we were left free to roam around, and we built forts and swam in places that we weren't supposed to swim, and did a lot of things. If you came back with the horses and they weren't rubbed down, that was another really serious issue that you would be very heavily penalized for. But we would take the horses and roam around the woods and do what we wanted, and didn't really have to account for all that much. And so that part of it that came, there was a certain kind of discipline, but mixed with a fair amount of freedom that, looking back on it, I think was a pretty pretty nice background to have had.
After high school, you went to Wheaton College in Massachusetts. Did you know when you went to college that you wanted to go and be a lawyer? At what point did you develop the interest in law?
Oh, no, I had no idea when I went to college or when I was at college. And in fact, I don't remember anybody from my college class applying to law school. So, I mean, it really wasn't in the horizon. I did have some professors who were very encouraging. They had been looking for someone for many years whom they could send to Harvard, because this was a Harvard-educated history department that I majored in history. And so they kind of picked me out as someone, you're going to go and get a PhD in history, which in the absence of any other great idea, I went along with and went to Harvard, and it was, I had a terrible, it was not a pleasant experience for me. This was 1968, 69, which if you know anything about this time, was a very, not a whole lot of education was going on at Harvard University at that time. But I left it after a year and became a school teacher, which is what, this was 1969 at this point, which was a very, which is something that women often chose to do. It was one of the really good career options. Teaching jobs were not that easy to get, in part because there were so many women
You had mentioned
teaching.
you'd gone back to the high school you attended
Yes.
to teach?
Yes. I was a very traditional person. I wish I could reference something that happened earlier this afternoon here, but yes, I went back to the same high school I had gone to and taught school with some of the people who had been my teachers.
So at what point did you become interested in law and decide to apply for law school?
Well, I reached a point in my personal life, which I won't go into detail about with this large an audience, but where I really wanted a big change in my life. And I decided I was going to go as far away from there. I mean, it was growing up in not only a family, but a town where people stayed put. And I decided I was going to break free. So in 1971, I applied to lots and lots of cities to get teaching jobs. I applied to Denver and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago, I think Dallas, trying to get a teaching job somewhere else. And then as a backup, I also applied to law school. At one point, my mother had been a legal secretary, and at one point I remember she had said to me, when I was going off to Harvard, I remember I was packing my bags, literally, and I said, is this the right decision? I always knew that it wasn't sort of a really thought-out decision. Is this the right decision for me? And my mother, who never gave advice, rarely answered a direct question, said, with a direct answer, said, you know, I always thought I could have been a lawyer. And I just kind of packed that away. And several years later, when I was thinking, as I say, of a backup plan, I said, you know, I'm going to just shoot off a bunch of law school applications as well. And so I applied to a lot of public schools where I thought I could manage the tuition. And it turned out I didn't get a single, I was a really good high school teacher, let me tell you. I did not get a single nibble for high school teaching at these cities. Again, the teaching profession was at this time, in part because so many women were teachers, and that was one of the few opportunities for really good, solid, interesting work. But I got into all these law schools, and so I went to the one furthest away, UC Berkeley, and that was my very well thought out interest in law.
What was your law school experience like once you got there?
I absolutely love law school. Law school was so much better than college for me. College, I went to an all-women's school, Wheaton College, and it's not all women's now, but it was at the time. I was on work study. I had about 4 different jobs at once. You know, felt like, you know, I was either studying or in the dish room or waiting on the other students in the dining room or trading in laundry. And I had a lot of those jobs in school, and I really didn't feel either very courageous or with many opportunities to do much else than nose to the grindstone. I was also, you know, this was a big deal to be at college and to, you know, to not want to let my family down and to do well. And I'd done well before, so I thought I needed to do just as well then. And so it was, I didn't have really a very good perspective on what there was that I should be getting out of college besides the studying. So that's really all I did was study and work. College, I was 3 years older and had been through a lot more of life at that point. And Berkeley was so exciting, and there were so many opportunities. There were a lot of, I was at the time when I entered law school 25, and there were a lot of other 25-year-olds there and even older, and it was just a whole new world for me. Plus, I just loved the study of law. It was so much more exciting and exhilarating. It was different. It was a new way of thinking. And I really took to it. I just thought that I was finally somewhere I really, really, really wanted to be.
Did you have favorite classes?
I liked, probably, these aren't the areas I became, drawn to later, but Jesse Chopra taught a fantastic corporations class, what we call here business associations. He also taught constitutional law, which I took from him. Really enjoyed my small section contracts experience. I don't remember classes so much as, that's not really an organizing principle for me when I think back about what had meaning for me. I can think of particular class days where things happened that were really interesting and that stuck with me, or exchanges with students or faculty outside of class, but the course itself seemed to be incidental to the experience.
When you graduated from Bolt, what did you do next?
Well, when I was a third year at Bolt, I worked, I took a clinic that was a placement clinic in a legal services office, and I loved it. I absolutely loved that. But I pretty much liked everything, except for the teaching high school, where I went to high school. I pretty much liked everything I've ever done. And I just loved this experience. And so I decided, although I entered law school thinking I was probably going to do something with children. I had worked in the high school setting. I had children who were in trouble with the law, and I kind of thought that was, if there was a reason, although, as I said before, it wasn't very well thought out, that kind of work with children might be kind of interesting. But I loved the variety and the type of people I was helping in the legal services practice, so I thought, this is what I want to do. And I tried really hard to get a job in the same legal services office that I had worked in as a student. Applied and came really close but didn't get the job. So so that summer, while I was studying for the California bar exam, I saw a recent appointment. Ronald Reagan was the governor at that time of California, had just appointed a new justice, Frank Richardson, and so I applied for that job and got it. Worked then as a law clerk on the California Supreme Court for that first year, reapplied to the legal services job, and then got it the second time around. So that was a happy ending to that story, and I stayed there for the full amount of time that we remained in California.
And during this time, you met Chris also at Bolt, if I'm right.
I met him in law school. He was a class ahead of me, my husband, and we were married right after I graduated in 1975.
How did you become a law teacher? At what point did you decide that going into legal academia was something of interest to you?
The answer to that kind of tracks my answer to the how did you get interested in law and go to law school question. I really kind of backed into it. At the time, we decided to leave California. At the time, my husband, who was in a law firm practice in San Francisco, had always wanted to go into teaching. And at the time that our two oldest children were babies, the second one had just been born, it seemed like a particularly good time to be looking for a career change because I was not, although I worked full-time after our oldest was born, by the time we had two, it seemed too much. So it was a good time for me to be a trailing spouse. So Chris applied to various teaching positions, and it all came down to Austin, Texas, Charlottesville, and Durham. And we picked Durham because it looked like this area would have the most amount of opportunity for me when I decided to re-enter full-time paid employment. So we moved here, and I applied for a legal services job, which is what I really wanted to continue, and once again came up empty. So I didn't care if I had full-time work at that point. But Paul Carrington, who was the dean then, said, you've had some trial experiences, you've had some litigation experience. We really need someone to fill in a pretrial litigation class. And I think there might be somebody in this room who actually took this first class, Rob Zina. I probably wasn't 100% qualified for this position, but I did. But I did take it and taught that for a few years, and then gradually sort of got into other fields, and eventually became full-time, and eventually more than full-time.
You're renowned as one of the leading scholars in the country in the area of feminist jurisprudence. How did that come about as an interest? Are there particular writings in that area that you're most proud of?
Well, first, the interest, I'll deal with that really quickly. Again, no deliberate plan that I worked out when I was age 12 or age 8. I just sort of followed my nose, took advantage of some opportunities that fell my way. But it was, I actually taught family law before I taught the gender and law class. Became interested in gender issues really through family law. Again, family law was a course that Paul Carrington needed someone to teach. And what I'm most proud of is probably, it's not one of the things that has the prestige of some of the other things I've published, but what I really, I think, am most proud of is the gender and law teaching materials, the casebook that I wrote, because that represented, before then, sex discrimination. I taught the first, I was a student in the very first sex discrimination course that was taught from published materials, Herman Hill K at Bolt Hall. And her book and every book written since then, until this time, was organized by taking slices of already existing courses. So there would be a chapter on employment, sex discrimination in employment law and criminal law and family law and already existing areas. And what I did in my casebook was to reorganize the field by theoretical category. In other words, to ask and answer the question, what should be the relationship between law and gender? What should be the goals of the law relating to gender? And so each chapter, using materials from all different areas of the law, exemplifies a certain set of assumptions and a certain set of goals. Just to give one example, or maybe I have to give two examples to give it meaning. So, for example, if we assume that women and men were exactly identical in every way that mattered, then we would just not pay any attention to it at all for any purpose. And so that's the kind of formal equality structure. It's the set of assumptions that really brought about Title VII and a lot of that rapid fire improvement in the rights of women in the 1970s and 1980s. Or we could decide that at least for some purposes, women were different from men, and those differences were handicapping, and we should try to make up for those differences so that women and men could be brought to an equal plane. And that requires some interference by the law, some nudges, maybe something called affirmative action or taking account of pregnancy as if it's different from other disabilities, and doing other interventions so that women and men would be brought to an equal plane. Another, maybe I'll have to give a third example and then I'll stop there, although there are 6 frameworks in the book. Another would be building on that other one, but spinning it the other way. Women and men are different, but women are different in ways which would serve as a better model for society than the model we now have. In other words, valorizing or crediting women's differences and trying to make society fit women in a positive way rather than looking at women's differences as handicaps that ought to be overcome through the law and employer activity and so on. So now if I answered your question.
Yes.
So that reconstructing of the field was really, for me, a bigger intellectual breakthrough, I think, and more meaningful in terms of how we look at gender issues than any of the other work I've done, although some of my other things have been more cited as intellectual products.
You had mentioned a few minutes ago that you and Chris have 3 children. I think everyone in this room who's an attorney would say that the biggest struggle professionals face is how to balance the professional life and the family life. What's that been like for you?
There have certainly been hard points, and we've handled it in different ways along the line. As I say, when our first child was born, I went right back to work. She cried all the time, and I thought I was going to stay home with her for longer than I actually did. It turned out to be, it was just something I needed, sort of needed to get away from. And by the time the third one came along, we had full-time help in the house. It was quite a difference. I really don't think that academics, at least fully productive, active academics, work fewer hours than people who go the law firm route. But there's no doubt that there's greater flexibility. I mean, I work a lot. I mean, especially now that all the kids have left home. A lot of weekends and evenings and so on and so forth. But I've always valued, and particularly having a husband who's also in academia, that kind of flexibility, that ability to go and pick up somebody from soccer or, all the kind of transportation and parent-teacher conferences and all that kind of stuff. So, I think I've had the same difficulties that many in this room have struggled with, and I like to see it becoming more and more a joint family set of responsibilities than having it fall on one spouse or the other. I have to. The question reminds me of when I was asked to take this job. You don't know this story, but some people know that I resisted it for some time, and was in the president's office when the real arm twisting event happened, and I said, Nan, the reason I'm really can't do what you ask is that I still have, one of our children is still in the home, and I just can't imagine taking any more time away from that. And she said, if you take this job, I'm sure that all of your children will be very proud of you. This was a very smart strategist, yes. I have used that line on people a couple of times myself since. But it's a more serious problem than that anecdote shows. But I do think that having the kind of job where you can bring your children into it somewhat. Chris had our 2 older kids in his class once reenacting a scene from Pearson versus Post, where they wonder where 2 people shoot at the fox and it falls down and they start arguing over whose fox it is. It reenacted that scene with an L.L. Bean stuffed fox, and they're very involved in the sports that they like and following Duke basketball, and there's a way that I think all of us have the opportunity to get our children engaged, at least in part, in what we do, that where you can try to make it somewhat of a family affair, but it doesn't make the basic tension go away.
So you've been persuaded to become dean, something we're all thankful for. You've been phenomenally successful. You still are dean, of course, at least through the rest of this year. As you look back at this point, are there particular things you're most proud of having accomplished as dean? Are there things that you most regard as mistakes or things you regret from your time as dean?
Well, on behalf of the school, I would have to say that the thing we should feel best about is the quality of faculty we've been able to recruit here. You, of course, being one example and a great example, but there are a number of others as well. And I think it's really changed and upgraded the quality of the instruction and the research profile, and I think we all should feel pleased about that, and I'm really proud to have been dean when all of that happened.
And if I can just interject, we would not be here but for you. And I think that's true of almost all of the faculty that have joined during the time that you've been dean. You've been more than instrumental in bringing the people who are here.
Thank you.
I didn't mean to interrupt with that.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'm also very pleased, although I have to say this wasn't in the game plan 6 or 7 years ago, that we have seen the growth in clinical programs that we have seen. became, not, you might have thought with my commitment to legal services and that being my background and my career, that would have been a natural for me, but I had to see it, and it began teaching, in fact, in a quasi-clinical course. It seemed like a very expensive way to educate law students. It still is expensive as it used to be, but I've really come to see that there's no substitute for what we provide our students in the clinics. And particularly as we have become more appreciative as a school of the need to do something very different in the third year than what we do in the first and second year. Clinics have to be a big piece of that puzzle. We just have to give a lot of attention to that transition between a very academic, sit in this kind of room sort of education to where students will enter practice positions and really have an ability to do things that we just can't teach them in rooms like this. And it's everything from, a lot of it's the leadership component that we've also talked a lot about, but just paying attention to how students interact with one another, how they can come together to shape common goals, and then be very pragmatic about how to carry out those goals, reach those new targets, how they can become problem solvers. There's a lot that goes into that, and you just can't do a few case studies in a classroom setting and expect to have students get to where you want them to be. As it is, even with a really strong clinical program and leadership initiatives and so on, students are going to enter law firms and other forms of practice without being able to add value for a while. But we're kind of accelerating that process, I think, and not only that, giving them things that they won't get in their law firms. A certain kind of teaching environment where they can make mistakes and not be penalized, and where they can learn from one another in a helping, supportive role. Some of this, I think, at least the lore is, it may be an urban legend, but some of this used to happen more in the older style law firms, where it was a more kind of permanent commitment that you made to a family type law firm setting. Those are harder to find. So many of our students enter law firm practice now with absolutely no intention of staying there any more than 2 or 3 years, and the firms feel the same way. And it's a very different set of economic principles. So that does put the onus on the law schools to really be paying attention to character development and to other professional skills that is still valued in the market, but not necessarily being taught in their first jobs.
What are the things about your deanship that you might regret that haven't gone as well? Or what have been your biggest frustrations as dean?
Well, we haven't quadrupled our endowment or our annual non-restrictive funds. But actually, I'm actually very, very pleased with what we've been able to achieve in fundraising. I think probably the thing that I would urge the next dean to pay the most attention to are our international relationships. I think I'm not a great traveler. I have been to many foreign locations since I've been dean, but not there as strong as my predecessor or as strong as I hope my successor will be in developing deep, productive relationships with foreign universities in a very strategic way, which is not to say reach out to every opportunity we have, but to think very strategically with the board and with the university about where we could most strategically form some partnerships and have those be very deep relationships. We have relationships with lots of universities. We send exchange students to many locations. We draw students from many other countries. But I would say we have not achieved the depth. We haven't chosen the real strategic opportunities and then achieved the depth of relationship that we need abroad, and I'd like to see that. I think I'd like to see that in the next 5 years.
What surprised you most about being dean? You'd been an academic for a long time before becoming a dean. What did you least expect that you've had to deal with?
Yeah, I'd been associate dean for a couple of years too, and I was still dealing with faculty issues. I was still surprised at how much care and feeding is required, at least among some faculty. And not necessarily the ones I would have predicted. So we don't have to go a lot further with that. But, it's a very, and this is something that friends of the law school, I hope, appreciate too. It's a very special place. I said this to a group this morning. It's a very special place in regard to how well faculty get along with each other and then the mutual respect between faculty and students. And this doesn't just happen. I inherited it. But it's required a lot of work to maintain, good work, not drudgery, but good work. And I think it's a fragile asset of this university, and that as we add new faculty, as we grow in size physically, as we develop relationships with foreign universities, as we do all these ambitious things that we want to do, we need to be really careful that what has made Duke really unique is not compromised. And I just that will be in my, when we have a new dean chosen, that will be high on my list of things to try to pass on in terms of not where the bodies are buried, where the skeletons are buried so much as the positives that I think that alumni appreciate, that current students appreciate, that existing faculty appreciate, that really we can't afford to squander. I don't know how you would even, as I say, I inherited good relationships. I don't exactly know how you would get those back if they were lost. So.
And I think that one of the astounding things, you've been able to bring in about a dozen new faculty in 3 years without it changing the nature of a very small institution. I think it's a huge tribute to you as dean. As you reflect on being dean, have there been favorite things that you've had to do as dean and least favorite things?
I don't like airplanes, and I don't like them I never got used to it. So traveling, I loved being at other places once I got there, and I've loved not so much the initial meeting, but this will not come as a surprise probably to anybody in this room that I'm not a great meet and greeter, but once I know someone somewhat, I love getting to know them better. So that part I've really liked, and thankfully, because I'm intending to stay at Duke, I would hope that those relationships would continue to deepen. I don't like, I wish that it were possible to have a job like this with less stress. There may not be a person in this room who wouldn't say that they wish there was less stress in their life, so I'm probably not adding anything to the table here, but it just seems like, being a very optimistic person, I have, for almost 60 years, always thought that there was a light at the very end, at the near end of the tunnel, and it always seems like there's just more and more that you're not quite on top of, and I think I'm going to learn pretty soon to be in a different place with that stress than taking it all as personally as I tend to. But most of us could learn something about that.
When we talked at the beginning of the week about this, you said you wanted to leave some time for the audience questions. And so I think we had decided we were going to leave 15 minutes of our hour for the opportunity for the audience to ask questions. And if they don't, I've got lots more questions I can ask. Please.
Kate, you said, you implied that there were a couple of days in law school that you had experiences that weren't necessarily associated with the whole course. Would you mind, giving us a description of one of those epiphanies?
Do I need to repeat the questions for the tape?
Not for the tape.
What?
Not for the tape.
We're okay. We don't need to repeat the questions. Okay.
You know, I'm not a great, I don't have a great story to tell you that kind of represents those moments. It's more snapshots. You know, it's more kind of the excitement of being part of unraveling a civil procedure question that I thought was absolutely impossible and I could never possibly get on top of. It's sort of that, I don't think I could reconstruct those moments very well. I did a lot of backpacking and hiking when I was in law school, and so I have memories of, you know, unbelievable camping trips with, you know, 60 people from my class and you know, singing Grateful Dead songs into the wee hours. That sort of memory that, as you can imagine, I can't go a whole lot further with right here.
I don't know if our students have that experience. Please.
You said you accepted the job as dean due to some arm twisting, and particularly because of what legacy you might leave your children. What do you think you've left your children from this part of your life?
You know, this is a moving target because my children have gotten older as I've progressed through this job. My youngest child is going to turn 21 next week, so that's sort of just a situation. And my oldest one will be 30 next month. I have been with my children on occasions in which they have clearly looked at me a different way. And I don't know whether I had to be dean for that to happen. In fact, the first one of those moments was when my son was a freshman or a sophomore at Princeton. And I was invited by the history department at Princeton to come and give a talk. And so I gave it, and although he wouldn't have otherwise have gone to a talk on this topic, he had to come because it was his mother, and so he came, and I gave a lecture, and I can't remember what it was on, but he came up afterwards and he said, "Mom," he said, "I had no idea." And it was like he'd never, you know, even tossing around a fox in a classroom. I mean, he didn't. I think most children really don't connect in a very meaningful way with what their children do unless they work in the business or are really given a hands-on role. That same son was with me last week when I received the Equal Justice Works Award, and he's now a lawyer himself and working in D.C. And that was a very special honor to share with
Does anyone
child.
here know about that? That you were honored by Equal
I
Justice
think
Works?
enough people know. And we don't
Well,
have to
but
go
not
into
everybody. Equal Justice Works is a preeminent public interest organization about fostering work by law students' public interest. Every year they choose one dean in the entire country to honor for his or her contribution to public interest work. And Kate received that award this year among all the deans in the country. Other questions? Please.
What changes have you noticed in the student body over the time that you've been dean or since you've been here at the school, if any?
You know, one of the reasons I hesitate here is because I know my students in a different way than I did before I became dean. I taught a couple of courses the first couple of years I was dean, but I haven't taught a regular classroom course in a few years now. And I see much more of what students have accomplished outside the classroom than I used to see because it's more of my business to see that. So with that reservation, what I would go ahead and say is I see a student body today at Duke Law School, notwithstanding years of very activist students, always, who did, many student groups who did many active things. The commitment that our students today have to making Duke Law School a better place, to making contributions to some pro bono or public interest activities, to attending lectures and events that happen. We will adjourn at some point from this, in a few minutes, from this event, and we'll all be able to go to the International Food Festival. This is just an enormous student production. I doubt they're going to let us down this year. In previous years, of course, it's raining this year, so who knows? But it's just an enormous student effort to build community. It's a very community-minded student body. Some of you know that Duke Law School has the largest bowling league in the state of North Carolina, and I'm not sure 20 years ago that sort of would have been something that would have organically happened. But I think the emphasis on the importance of community and what a person can get out of being a very active member in a community has really taken hold here. I don't know how that compares to other law schools, but it's the thing that feels most tangible to me.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, we've got Carol Spruill, Associate Dean of Pro Bono and Public Interest. She's been a very important figure in the pro bono and public interest world. We've got a student affairs outfit led by Jill Miller, which has made student organizations be transformed from something you did with your spare time as a kind of low priority to something that is perceived by students as being not just something to pursue a special interest, but something from which leadership skills can emerge and sort of an important part of your legal and professional education. But I have to say, I'm impressed when I go to other law schools too at the commitment of students to making a better community, both internally and outside the law school in the cities in which they find themselves. And I think this is very promising for the profession. And that if the profession, to the extent the profession allows attorneys to follow these sorts of instincts and passions that they have to make, to say it somewhat cornily, I guess, make the world a better place, that there are a lot of lawyers that law schools turn out at Duke and elsewhere who really want to make that happen. And to the extent that we as legal professionals in whatever place we find ourselves are able to facilitate that, I think lawyers everywhere are going to be happier people.
Other questions? I guess I'll end by saying, other reflections that you have that you want to share with all of us?
The question I thought, the arm twisting the question that started with the arm twisting question, I thought you were going to ask, are you sorry you took the job? And I hope, so this is not going to be any more inspiring than to answer a very self-referential question, but I hope there's no doubt by anyone who has interacted with me in this job that I have really loved and continue to love it for another 8 or 9 months. I have really liked this, really appreciated the opportunity to have this job. And I think the personal growth that I've experienced is maybe, just to speak in very personal terms, what I've appreciated the most. I mean, that sense, maybe that same sense, to link this back to my first year of law school, where I felt like my mind was expanding exponentially every week. I just knew so much more and had my horizons expanded so much more. And this job has been like that in the sense of...
Could you give some examples before we finish?
I'm, again, not so great with examples, but what I'm talking about is feeling like there was something ahead of me that could not be done by me. And yet, with the help of others, we got there. We did something that we thought couldn't be done, and occasionally there's the time to figure out what effect or what that's meant about me as a person. Tend to think more institutionally about what it says about us as an institution, but certainly that you know, I don't know how it's difficult to really enjoy life, I think, without feeling like you're still growing, and this is a job that really was a period of accelerated personal as well as institutional growth, and I'm very appreciative of it.
I think it's a great place then. Please join me in thanking Kate for inspiring us all.
Thank you.